Welcome to the Network's Friday Forum, Democratizing Land Use, Who Holds the Power Moving Forward. I'm Cynthia Stewart, I'm with the network. Thank you so very much for joining. This is the third forum in our series that we're hosting weekly on Fridays through June 25th. I'd like to thank our sponsors and nonprofit partners who generously supported the series. And please check out our exhibitor gallery, the link to which you can find in the chat throughout the conversation. While the series is called Friday Forums, next week's forums will take place on Thursday, June 17th, as we'll be observing Juneteenth on Friday. So please join us next Thursday for an interactive workshop on restorative justice at 10 a.m. and a panel on wage equity in the human services sector with Urban Pathways, HSC, Power, and Attorney General Tish James at 1 p.m. Links to register for those forums are posted in the chat as well. I'm going to turn over the conversation now to BRC's Nicole Clare. Thanks so very much. Nicole?
Yeah, hi, thanks Cynthia, and thanks to the network for organizing this panel today. As Cynthia mentioned, my name is Nicole Clare. I'm the Chief Real Estate Development Officer at BRC. We are a developer and service provider working in the city. And I want to introduce our other panelists today. I'm going to start with Lorraine Collins, the Director of Public Policy and External Affairs at Enterprise Community Partners. Conor Dougherty, economics reporter at the New York Times and author of the book Golden Gates, The Housing Crisis and a Reckoning for the American Dream, now out in paperback. And Tommy Newman, Senior Director of Impact Initiatives at the United Way of Greater Los Angeles, and their innovative campaign called Everyone In. So thanks again for joining our panel. As we mentioned, the title of our panel today is Democratizing Land Use, Who Holds the Power Moving Forward. But just to kick off, before we set our direction for the future, let's discuss how we got here and where we are now. So our panel will talk about examples from New York, where we are, and also California, where Conor and Tommy are, as both places are experiencing similar challenges with homelessness, the need for more supportive and affordable housing. So I'm gonna kick off with Conor. So if you could maybe take us through the history of land use policies, certainly in the US, that got us to this point.
Well, I don't think we have enough time for all of that.
Sure,
but,
part of that.
Yeah, so here's the way I think about it, and the sort of struggle we're dealing with today. We came up with really restrictive land policies under pretty explicit racism. Obviously a lot's been talked about and written about redlining, which was FHA. I mean, I'm sure everyone on this call is very familiar with it, but obviously it's a means by which the government essentially extended cheap credit to white families and not to anyone else. And of course, there were racial covenants and things like that sort of explicitly, would write into the rules of subdivisions, and it would be as ordinary to say only white people can live in this neighborhood as it would be to say, and please don't put billboards on your roof, or you keep your lawn up. It was that programmed into how our housing market worked. And we've obviously come a long way in terms of getting rid of rules that are that explicit and that nasty. I should note California passed the Fair Housing Act. It was actually really effective in 1963, 5 years before the federal Fair Housing Act. But as we all know, we are as segregated as we've ever been, racially, and even more so financially. And so I think one of the things we all struggle with, because this leads to sort of a difficult set of solutions, is if this sort of system is now maintained by basically economics. It's maintained by home prices that are so high that only people who have tremendous assets, who tend to be, of course, disproportionately whiter, can afford them. If rental units, if neighborhoods are gentrifying, if apartments that are affordable aren't even allowed in good school districts, but all this is done under, the guise of discriminating essentially against buildings or building types, or mortgage types or rental voucher types, right? If this is all done under that kind of rubric, it's basically legal. I mean, there are of course some exceptions to this, and so I think that's what we're all struggling with, is that we got here through a way that everyone pretty much would say, we don't want to go back, that was nasty, that was a horrible part of America's legacy, but we maintain it with an economics that leads to a lot of disagreement about, oh, is this fair to me? Is this, why should my neighborhood change? That sort of thing. And I think what we're all searching for in terms of advocacy, the law, zoning, whatever, is how do we sort of make that connection? How do we bridge? How do we find policy that can bridge the world we should have had 50 years ago with where we are now? So anyway.
Right, and to that point, it advantages current property owners, current owners of in neighborhoods. Lorraine, did you have anything to add there, or did you want to?
Yes, well, thank you for having me, Nicole, and to my co-panelists. I think Conor, really laid out the basics in terms of how we've gotten here. When we're talking about economics, I think the economics, the power shift, the power struggle takes on many faces, right? So it's, who is elected in office, who's making those decisions, what resources look like in terms of the economic resources of individuals who are either tenants or homeowners, as well as, again, to Conor's point, the demand, the supply, demand, and the cost, and how that in and of itself excludes individuals from homeownership opportunities. And when you have zoning policies in place that really restrict the type of development, while on the surface, on the face, it may look like it's building oriented, but it really is designed to impact the people and how we live and how we interact with one another. But I think also a big part of that is, it comes down to, who has the power, what does legislation look like, what choices are individuals choosing to make versus those that they are forced to make. And then at the end of the day, how do we bring about some common good so that folks are all living in decent, safe, affordable housing, despite the neighborhood, despite the area.
Right. And then, me, myself, also being a developer, recognizing that in order to get any new projects done and bring in more affordable housing, and specifically for, supportive housing that we're focused on here, it's having to go to those communities and ask for changes, land use changes, and that's where we get into the challenging situation. So that gets into my next question of, certainly thinking about New York State, and there is money, and, we call it kind of alleged desire to add more, including supportive housing. We know there are large swaths of areas that are seemingly off limits. These are often white, wealthy areas that are big parts of cities and other communities. So in New York City, I'm thinking certain neighborhoods in Queens, pretty much all of Staten Island. So the challenge is, how do we kind of come up with strategies to address this situation? So I know historically we've looked at it from a fair housing and fair share perspective. So Lorraine, if you could maybe speak to a little bit about what you're doing on that end in the state, New York State.
Sure, and it's a collective effort, right? There's no one organization, no one sector who could really bring about the change that a lot of us desire to see. For the work that enterprise has been involved in, really working in close partnership with our fair housing leaders, Fair Housing Justice Center, we co-convene a regional affordable fair housing roundtable, and hopefully some of the participants here today are familiar with that or even were a part of that process, where over the course of a year, we brought together fair housers and affordable housers to really come up with some ideas as to how we could work together on a policy platform, lifting up those common policy goals and focusing a lot less on the things that we weren't necessarily in agreement with. And one of the items that we lifted up was this idea of a statewide fair share housing plan. Understanding that we live in a state where housing markets are very much regional, very different across the state, but also understanding that once you dissect and go into those regions, the storyline is pretty much the same. There are communities that are off limits when it comes to certainly affordable housing development. But even when we're looking at mixed income, mixed use, those communities are off limits. So collectively over the last several years, we've been trying to think about, what could that state legislation look like? Not necessarily starting from scratch, because there are examples nationwide where both other states and local municipal governments have had some success in considering fair share and ensuring that, some portion of development is set aside for low mod income individuals. And so now we're at a point where, we're really trying to galvanize a lot more support statewide. And there are other partners who have certainly come to the table to be a part of the conversation as to what could that legislation look like? What could those efforts look like in the state of New York? Considering that we're so dynamic and we're so diverse. And it really is about, galvanizing those relationships, interacting with our state elected officials, lifting this up to the state level. But in our conversations, also understanding, given that we are a home rule state, some type of support needs to complement that. And so as we've talked about a fair share housing plan, we've also talked about what a housing appeal board would look like at the state level. And again, not a unique idea. It's something that has been tried in other areas. And not that it's an attempt to strip away local or local support or the homeroom concept, but when we know that we have developers who are coming up against strongholds, and some of it is in the name of it's environmental, it's the education system, it's infrastructure, but in large part it is very much NIMBY. It is very much economic or racial, ethnic discrimination and socioeconomic discrimination. And so to the extent that we, particularly in this day and age that we're living in a post George Floyd murder era, I think there's a lot more attention that is being given to what does equity look like in the realm of affordable housing development as well as supportive housing development.
Yeah, you raised some great points about organizing and combating the NIMBYism. So that's why I wanted to bring in Tommy as a good example to tell us more about what he's been able to do in California with the Everyone In campaign.
Yeah, no, happy to do it. And thank you, Nicole. And I feel like that was a tough warm-up. So let's talk about NIMBYs and throw it to Tommy, who is not a NIMBY, to be clear, but rather trying to figure out how we out-organize these folks. We here in LA, and I know New York and the network has been a great partner of us sort of sharing ideas and bouncing back. And in fact, a bunch of folks on my team were able to come out, I think a couple of years ago now, pre-pandemic. And so I really appreciated that relationship because, as you all know, we have not historically had the type of financial resources that exist in New York. And recently we started to create more of those, passing some big bond measures, passing a sales tax increase in LA County, and starting to dramatically increase the resources. But then, of course, the next concern was, well, can we build any of this supportive housing? Can we deploy these resources for interim housing across LA County? And so we, United Way, who helped pass those ballot measures, then sort of jumped into the next chapter of the work and began to create a campaign that was intended on mobilizing the sort of squishy, soft middle of people who are out there who can be mobilized and can be persuaded. Like, in fact, we know that it is the angriest of the angry, the nimbys, whatever we want to call them, are a remarkably small percentage of the whole, but they're loud and they're motivated and they have power, to the theme of this conversation today, who has the power. So the purpose of our Everyone In campaign has been to activate and mobilize all the other folks who historically have not been part of this conversation. And as we've worked to do that, as we have worked to find those folks with lots of creative strategies, using lots of digital advertising and events and community engagement approaches to sort of like make this less wonky and make it more human, which is always our goal. We've then tried to direct that energy to first, I'll say our genesis. First, we thought we were going to be the campaign to fight these local fights, right? Like, there's $1 billion for supportive housing. We're going to build 10,000 units. And so we're going to create the campaign that shows up in these community meetings and battles it out with the angry, racist haters. And we did that for like a good year, and it was pretty unpleasant. And along the way, we were like, wait a minute, why don't we just focus our energy on changing the rules of the game so that we're not continuing to empower this angry, nasty crew? And so our first example of that was mobilizing our campaign to exempt supportive housing from the California Environmental Quality Act. And so we used state legislation, AB 1197, to do exactly that. And so now the primary tool that the NIMBYs and other opponents were using to delay these projects, the California Environmental Quality Act, is off the table. And that starts to change the equation. You can have a community meeting where everybody screams, but if they don't have the ability to stop this project, if it's a by right project, you can build an apartment building, and they can't use fake environmental lawsuits to sue to stop it. Well, now you're starting to change the balance of who has the power. And so that's been our lesson, and I know we're going to dig deeper into it today. We can't keep playing into the hyper localization of land use policy. We can't say, okay, well, we're just going to go fight them hand for hand. We've got to regionalize it. We've got to take it to the state level. I love the fair share concept that Lorraine's talking about. That's where the power should be. And Conor knows and has written a lot about this, sort of the balance between hyper-local control and regionalization is where the fight needs to be, because that's how you can actually move the needle.
Yeah, that's a great segue for you, Conor. I don't know if you can bring in even some examples we've seen in Minneapolis where they've, eliminated single-family homes and are trying to make an effort around affordable housing.
Yeah, I feel like it's interesting. We have had a really big, obviously my book is about this, but we've had a very fractious conversation about density around the country. This has been true in New York. It's been true in pretty much every, I think, from very small suburbs to, in this case, in states like California, 40 million people, at every kind of level of government. We had a President Obama did a thing called this, the toolkit that was sort of for removing local barriers to housing, and Biden has sort of something similar. Sort of weirdly, Trump kind of had one that was, he signed this one that was like, we're going to get rid of the NIMBYs. And then he was like, they're coming for your suburban homes. So that one was a little more schizophrenic. But anyway, this has been a conversation we've had, and it's been full of debate, fractious debate, as Tommy said. But I feel like we've sort of vaguely settled on a direction. And that direction seems to be, they're going to allow a lot more backyard homes, which are, these ADUs, accessory dwelling units. That's kind of been a pretty consistent theme in cities around the country. Not all, but it certainly has played out. And then we're starting to see places move towards more duplexes and triplexes. Minneapolis, as you mentioned, passed a law where you can now by right build a triplex on any city lot. Now, we could have a whole forum on how those laws will actually be implemented, how well they will work. But generally speaking, the cities that kind of want to do it and are volunteering to do it, and their city councils are very enthusiastic about doing it, it's going pretty well. LA has had this, sort of building boom of accessory dwelling units, and because they really want to, they've made it very easy to get them permitted and that sort of thing. Of course, other cities, more, Woodbridge, Connecticut, not too far from, next to New Haven, they're fighting like mad to stop it. So I think the question is so that's kind of like where the debate has settled. But I think that when we start talking about how we're going to build affordable housing, we're probably going to have to end up back in the sort of, this is where I should turn the questions to you, but we're probably going to have to turn there's going to be some role for large multifamily in that. It doesn't sort of seem that it can be any other way. So I think that what I'm sort of saying is we have moved, and it's worth at least taking a moment to say, we have moved a little. Single family neighborhoods are allowing a lot more stuff. You're seeing more different housing types, very few for families thus far, but I think hopefully that will start to change. So we have gotten somewhere in the density debate, but I don't think and it's perhaps possible that that's all that single family home neighborhoods should be asked to do. If you really could build more on their transit corridors and stuff, I think that could work. It doesn't have to be a bulldozer everywhere. But I guess what I'm saying is that the debate has moved, and it sort of started to congeal in this place, this light density place, but there's still a lot of work to be done about how we're going to build large multifamily and supportive housing on the scale that we need to truly stabilize families and then make some kind of dent in our homeless situation.
Right. I think that brings it back to the point that every locality is really, holding on tightly to that control. So maybe a way to get there is to move, land use policy to a higher level of government. Obviously, if it happens at the state level, to really mandate it across communities. So Lorraine, wondering if you could jump in there to talk a little bit more about potentially how that could happen.
Yeah. Again, I go back to it will take a village really to make it happen, in terms of definitely being able to pass some legislation at the state level. And honestly, one of the things that has come up in our conversations to date, as we consider this, looking at other states, other options that have been tried, some have been successful, some not so much, is again the diversity in the housing market in the state of New York, and being able to provide local officials with some form of options. Like, those are some of the things that we've talked about as of late. Like, we can't go into this like with a one cookie cutter approach. That's not going to work. New York City is very different than the Finger Lakes, which is very different from the North Country. And so being able to look at some of those options, and when we even say fair share, what do we mean? Are we just talking a certain percentage of new development? Is it a percentage of the overall housing stock? At what levels of AMI? I mean, these are all decisions in conversations that have to take place in order to, try to attempt to do it, quote unquote, right. And so I think a lot of it starts with, again, having, open and candid conversations, those who have, opposition, trying to figure out exactly or understand why does that opposition exist, to the extent you're able to find some common ground. And as I mentioned before, really expanding that network of advocacy, that Tommy spoke about, who really needs to be at the table. The development community needs to be at the table, both for-profit and nonprofit. Social service organizations, particularly when we're talking about supportive housing, has to be at the table. All levels of government, elected officials, state, local, and federal, have to be at the table in order to have, this conversation. And then when, we can take it to the level of, the private sector, employers who have employees that are traveling miles, the commute, the transportation is just ridiculous because they can't find affordable housing near their place of employment. and community benefits agreements when we're thinking about, organizations and businesses that are being given tax breaks to come into a community, but they aren't offering up anything, particularly as it relates to housing. I think there are a lot of lessons that we can also learn from the pandemic, which I think is another thing that has really pushed us having the conversation and digging a bit deeper and thinking, okay, if introducing legislation, how soon, what could that look like? As our economy has transitioned, has that opened up more opportunities for getting housing units on the market? And we had legislation recently passed here in New York, the Honda Act, which is looking at underutilized or underutilized hotels statewide. So what are other opportunities that we can begin to take advantage of? We had an affordable housing crisis, prior to the pandemic. Don't see that changing anytime soon, but we can really try to get ahead of the game and be more strategic in not letting opportunities pass us by.
Yeah, that you spoke a lot about how we build those coalitions. So Tommy, I'm hoping you could jump in here a little bit more and talk about maybe some more history of everyone in, what challenges you found in trying to build those coalitions, maybe how you've pivoted over the last few years.
Yeah, I know, I love that question. And that was, I think, to pick up where Lorraine left off, we need to get everybody at the table, but it can't be those sorts of tables we create where it's like, let's sit down with the angry hater local city council members and try to persuade them not to be angry haters. Like, no, we should build a coalition to steamroll them 100%. Like, that's what we should be building, because at least here in California, all land use power comes from the state, right? And so the state grants charters to these small cities and then gives them certain powers and authorities. And so we should go to where that power comes from, who holds the power. We shouldn't pretend like a local city, pick one, we have 88 of them in Los Angeles County, has this like God-given right to exclude people and prevent any future progress or creating inclusive communities. They don't. Their power comes from the state. So go to the state, and design a coalition is going to move the state. And to Conor's point about ADUs, the ADU laws didn't happen locally. The pressure came from the state to start and said, we need more ADUs. And they gave some time and a little wiggle room for the locals to figure it out, but kept their foot on the gas. And then in the most recent legislative session, they said, you can build another ADU, the junior ADU. So now you can do 2 of them. And then there's a bill in the legislature right now here, FB9, which is moved by the head of the state Senate to allow duplexes and lot splits on any single family lot. Like, so the land use revolution in California, if we want to call it that, not really a revolution quite yet, but some sort of gentle uprising is happening not from the locals, but from Sacramento. And so that tension, that balance means we need to be designing coalitions to move legislation in Sacramento and our purposes. And I would assume that the same is true in New York as well. And so then what do those coalitions look like? First and foremost, you got to understand where your votes are going to be. And, is there an urban rural split? And what are you trying to pull off, and who's going to be with you and who isn't? Where is labor? Labor has to be a key partner on this work. And that's often very hard for the affordable housing industry to go in anywhere in the direction of the trades, at least in California, not necessarily in the direction of the service workers. Business, we've been successful at having business at the table on some of this. Like, it can't just be your like classic affordable housing coalition, of which I am proud to have been any part and continue to be part of many of this. It's got to be bigger if you're trying to influence who holds the power and how you move it. And so that's been the purpose of everyone in. And we've tried to hold up our end of the deal by also mobilizing the constituents who previously haven't been part of this conversation, right? The vast majority of regular people are not weighing in on land use policy anywhere. And so how do you find them? And how do you activate them, and how do you mobilize them so that you can give that like slightly moderate, slightly suburban LA County legislature just enough of a push to know that, they're not entirely alone. And those people are out there. We've done a lot of research to segment LA County. We found that about a quarter of LA County is 100% with us on this. No question, no doubt. About 40% of LA County is what we would call a weak supporter, kind of skeptical. They are motivated not by building strong communities, not by creating access and opportunity for everybody. They are motivated by holding elected officials accountable. So how do you thread that needle? How do you not compromise your values? Because we are trying to create holistic communities. We are trying to dismantle the segregation that exists in our communities. But we can do that by holding our electeds accountable. So how do you speak that language to the 40%? And then knowing that, you know, there's like a quarter out there who are, you know, angry and nasty and awful, and they're never going to be with us, but they're only a quarter. And so how do you mobilize? Those are the opportunities and the challenges to be able to change who holds the power.
Great. Conor, if you could, if we talk about, you know, who has access to affordable housing, right? So we're dealing with the folks who are in communities now, and it's really their voice versus the people who really need it, like the workers. And I know your book touches on that. So if you could speak more to that.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, I sort of joke to people that, you know, our only bipartisanship in America is NIMBYism. You know, it's really, you know, it's you can go to a very conservative part of the country where they say, you know, land use should be or property rights should be sacrosanct, and, you know, there should be minimal regulation. But of course, they have every kind of regulation you could imagine to make sure that the neighborhood looks like it does. And you could go to a very liberal part where I'm from in San Francisco, where they sort of say we want affordable housing and want to make it as plentiful and you know, and equitable as possible, but just don't build it anywhere near where, you know, rich homes are, right? So this is a, you know, sort of a universally, I wouldn't say universally, but this is a strongly held view that cuts across a lot of different kinds of communities. Now, I think we should point out that having things happen to your neighborhood and losing things that you sort of treasured or seeing things change is very disrupting to every kind of, you know, to everybody, people in this country, people of every income, people of every race, people in other countries. It's a very, you know, there are slight differences. There are differences from place to place, but there is a deeply felt human thing that seeing your community change and feeling like you don't have control over it is very distressing. And so this is, of course, why you see this sort of odd coalition between, you know, sometimes you'll see anti-gentrification activists and, you know, very sort of hardcore NIMBY activists teaming up, not so much over the same things, but over like a specific bill. You know, they will, a bill that sort of eliminates control in both kinds of neighborhoods will be fought by both kinds of neighborhoods, and they will actually form coalitions to stop them, as we have seen in California. I think and this is, although Tommy has used some phrases of war in the course of this conversation, you know, attack the NIMBYs and go after them. I think that in the end, we sort of need to find, and this is something everybody has said, and so I'm not contributing much to the conversation here, but something more positive, you know, I mean, I don't know how that works, but I mean, I think fundamentally you have to find people a way to be happy about something. I mean, one thing people talk about with density is you get more services. There are all sorts of people you will see, again, you will even see this in neighborhoods that are worried about gentrification. A vocal group will show up and say, well, but do more kinds of services come with that? And, you know, I mean, that perspective is there too. So I'll just leave you with this. One of the observations I always, this is kind of just something I always think about myself is I've talked to a lot of, you know, so-called NIMBYs, and I've talked to a lot of so-called YIMBYs, which is, of course, the yes in my backyard activists. And the thing I find common about, I guess, what I would call people who aren't afraid of density isn't like a particular politics or a particular orientation. It's more that they are kind of chill. You know, that it's an odd way to think about it, but there's a certain kind of person where they say they're going to build something near there and they're just like, oh my God, you know, like they're what'll it be and who will live there and what will change and what, you know. And then there's like another kind of person, which is probably more people than you might think, who are like, you know, I think I'll be okay. You know, they just sort of like, I think, you know, it'll probably be fine, you know, like, and I guess, and then of course there are people who are, you know, really excited about it. And I guess I just feel like we need to find a way to make it, I think we need more things to happen, and maybe ADUs and things like this will be an open door, or will be a door opener for this, where you know, where people see, oh, you know, this can work, you know, a little bit didn't hurt, you know. Of course, if a little bit does hurt, I mean, this will vary from neighborhood to neighborhood, because of course there'll be one person who lives next to someone who's, you know, I don't know, setting off fireworks or whatever, you know, and then they will say everyone who lives in an ADU sets off fireworks. But I think that on the whole, people, as the world sort of adjusts, as we do make some minor progress, hopefully that will cause people to say, you know, maybe the worst didn't happen. And of course, we see all the time, as sure you see all the time. I'm sure you could tell us battle story after battle story, where you went into a place, people said the worst things you could ever imagine about you at a meeting. And then 5 years later, they're like, oh, you know, that worked out. Actually, it's fine. You know,
Exactly.
and I just feel like somehow we need the, like, that worked out people to be more vocal.
Yeah, and actually we're bringing in some of those voices to talk to the, you know, to the ones who were worried, to say those people were where you were, and now they recognize it wasn't as bad. All of those things that they feared didn't come to pass. So that's a piece of it. But you brought in, you raised some great points. You know, I think when you talk about those yimbys who are less afraid of change, I think people are afraid of change when they're such in a precarious position, right? And as we know, like economically explains sort of our whole politics right now, right? Since in the last decade. And we're starting to see, to that point, folks who, you know, even in historically, if we've been able to add supportive housing and affordable housing in low-income communities, some of those communities are now saying, that's it, I've had enough, right? And sort of learning the language of maybe higher income neighborhoods. So I wanted to maybe ask Tommy if he started to see any of those things that you know, low-income communities are basically picking up that NIMBYism thought, and how do we try to work with that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. The answer is yes. I mean, racism is deep in this, but also classism is deep in this. And sometimes classism is a more powerful uniter than racism. So, you know, that is out there and hard. I think this sort of interesting discussion that we're having, like, is there the kumbaya opportunity versus the, like, more surgical coalition building and winning, coalition building and steamrolling is the right debate to have. I can tell you that working at a place called United Way, and a place that's existed for coming up on 100 years and has always been the, like, convener and consensus builder, I have definitely, like, rocked the boat on saying, like, to a certain extent, yes, we can do those things, but, like, this is also fundamentally about power. And if we're talking about power, then you need to be realistic about what it takes to shift who has power. And I don't think we have a ton of examples in history of, like, a consensus building strategy to share power, a consensus building strategy to give up power. Like, I don't know if that's how it works. And so, you know, I think the point's well taken, and I see Alexander's comment, and I'd be curious to know, sort of framing to gain consensus, what does that mean? Like, you know, let's not kid ourselves over who holds power and then how that shifts.
Yeah, you mentioned a comment we got in the chat from Alexander, thank you, talking about affordable housing and really it sounds like almost making it a mandatory thing. So Lorraine, I don't know if that's something that has come up at all, thinking about mandatory inclusionary housing restrictions. You know, we've had those conversations in New York City specifically around, you know, higher density opportunities. So is that something that we could bring really statewide? You know, I think we have to look at if it works financially, but is that something that is possible?
Right, and that certainly is an option that has been discussed. You know, one of the models that has been tried in other parts of the country. I think Montgomery County, Maryland, is one that's known. I don't think there's 10%. I think it might be a little higher, but it's just the requirement of having a certain percentage of the housing stock, particularly new construction, that is set aside for specific AMI. So again, I think that may be one of the menu of options that works in some parts of the state, but I think that's also part of these conversations that we're having in terms of, you know, the cookie cutter for the entire state versus understanding the you know, the different markets. And, you know, probably something Tommy doesn't really like, but I think that's also some of the kumbaya, right? Okay, so if we can't get all of the different levels of government that fall under state, when you start with city, town, village, can't get everyone on the same page, you know, that's what a menu of option, you know, would hopefully provide some form of kumbaya, so that there would be a benefit that local elected officials would see and saying, okay, there is a need for affordable housing in my community. There are local laws that are prohibiting that. This is something that could work so that we can get units, you know, on the road.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, I wonder if Conor can pick it up. We're seeing some energy in the post-pandemic world about converting hotels into affordable housing. So is that sort of a natural place to start, and could happen, you know, even outside of cities?
Yeah. So yeah, I think so. In California, we've bought a bunch of hotels, and there's been a bunch of money to do more. They bought like 100 hotels. And I'm sure Tommy is involved in some of these. And I think this has been an amazing, you know, here's why I'm sort of equivocating. It has been an amazing demonstration project. And it has, of course, been, as everyone here knows, literally life-changing for the people who now have a home. I think what I'm most impressed by with it, though, is that it was the will to act and the ability to act in a really reasonable time frame. I know that sounds unsexy, right? But it's like the government the state government got a bunch of money. They set up a team to close the deals within a couple months, and they just went crazy. You know, they took a risk. You know, and I'm sure some of these deals will turn out to be, oh, you know, actually the hotel was in much worse condition than they thought, and they're going to have to renovate it. And I'm sure that in some instances, maybe an operator will run it who will, I don't know, whatever. I'm just saying there will be problems, right? But you know, when I was covering the Great Recession in, you know, for the Wall Street Journal in 2008 till you know, pretty much till recently, right? I mean, but you know, till you know, 11 or 12 is when things started to get better. When investors were buying massive amounts of single-family homes, and continue to, but particularly back then, they weren't like spending a lot of time like equivocating over every little deal. You know, they were like, let's take a big swing. The prices are good. There will be demand for this. Let's go for it, right? And I think that what impressed me about the hotels is it was a program that had the kind of urgency that could be competitive with that kind of you know, investment. And I thought that, you know, and I thought that, you know, we've talked a lot about, you know, community land trusts and things like that. If you can close those kinds of things the same way that the normal real estate market can, you really can start to build on some of these more innovative models. But you got to kind of you got to kind of like give a little and worry about it a little less, if that makes sense. And just sort of wrapping all these thoughts together, what I was encouraged by with the hotels wasn't so much the number of units, although that was, you know, notable. It wasn't because I thought it would solve homelessness. It wasn't because I thought it was problem free. It was because, okay, we're actually treating this crisis like a crisis. The coronavirus forced people to act, you know, there was a moment when the state of California, and I'm sure other states too, but they were seriously worried that there would be, you know, like news footage of like dump trucks, you know, having bodies loaded into them, because, you know, the outbreaks amongst these very vulnerable populations would be so bad. And I hope, maybe I'm being a little bit Pollyannish, but I hope that we've gotten to a point, or hope we can get to a point where we're sort of like, well, we have a crisis every day here. You know, let's treat this like an emergency every day. Now, I don't think it'll ever be like coronavirus, but I do think people are starting to recognize that the housing thing is so bad that that kind of urgency is needed. And so I think that, you know, eviction moratoriums, all these things, I think that the emergency thinking we adopted, hopefully some of it will carry over. I'm not naive enough to think all of it will.
Yeah,
There's one thing to add on that, Nicole.
Oh, please, yeah.
In addition to getting a large amount of money from the federal government that had a December 30th deadline for spending, which was a helpful motivator, the legislature here in California passed AB 83, which exempted any work or anything done on the buildings acquired from CEQA, as well as deemed whatever the use was going to be consistent with underlying zoning, aka it overrode local zoning. So you could take a hotel and turn it into a shelter, or you could take a hotel and turn it into PSH, and even if it was zoned as only hotel, that didn't matter anymore. So just to like layer that on, yeah, the urgency there and the willingness, the political will to like just knock out the barriers that existed was awesome and exciting. We have 2 local ballot measures that are a good example as well for like the ballot measure thing in California is sort of a double-edged sword of terribleness. Just looking most recently at the rideshare ballot measure, but also like great opportunity. And so the most significant land use reforms we've had in the city of LA in the last 5 decades, maybe a little late, yes, because Measure U was terrible in the 70s, was JJJ, which was put on the ballot by activists and labor and dramatically upzoned vast swaths of the city with an affordability requirement in there. And it was sold as jobs, JJJ, jobs, jobs, jobs. So to Conor's point, like what are the sweeteners? What's the pitch? What's the frame? It was like create good jobs, get people closer to their jobs, help people secure new jobs, right? And so that's just another example. Who holds the power and how do you shift that power? A lot of people who said, yeah, it's fine, to Conor's point about that like squishy middle of the population, voted yes on that bill. Jobs sounded good. They voted yes. They dramatically upzoned the city and created a lot more affordable housing.
Yeah, I wanted to give folks, as we get started wrapping up, a chance to ask some questions. So if you haven't already put them in the Q&A, please do so now. And I see one that I want to elevate. They asked if, anonymous attendee, if anyone could speak to the issue regarding now the veil has been lifted and explicit discrimination in land use exposed. Do we think that will actually create any incentives or leverage to influence broader land use policy changes? And you all, or Conor and Tommy started to talk about things happening at the federal level, right? Incentives and money from the feds really helping the states implement things. And we left them out of this conversation and should raise it. We know housing as infrastructure is starting to be floated in the bill. So I don't know if anyone had thoughts on that question. Lorraine, have you heard anything about, or sorry, I don't know, Conor, were you jumping in?
No, I was just laughing. I wanted somebody else.
Okay.
I want some of it. I'm curious what Lorraine has.
It's tough. I think we are cautiously optimistic, but I'll put that being cautiously optimistic into perspective. So, I've made reference to the pandemic. I've made reference to, again, the post George Floyd murder era. I've made reference to the resources as well of folks coming together. But I'll also say that at the beginning of 2021, our group of advocates thought that we would have legislation introduced, given these different dynamics. And now we're in June and we don't. And that is in large part because there are, state elected officials who have just even heard fair share in housing together and have panicked. So I think, again, as I've alluded to, as Tommy has alluded to in terms of his experience in California, it will take a lot of conversing to think about, what could be. But I also, again, in referencing the Honda Act, think that there are different ways that we could, envision how or what fair share looks like or what it could look like. The hotel conversions, other state-owned land, how's that being utilized? How can that be turned into affordable housing, either rental opportunities or home ownership? And we've talked about, the back and forth between single-family zoning versus multifamily zoning, but even, going back and forth between commercial and residential. Can we expand or do a lot more with those commercially zoned areas where we could allow for multifamily development? So I think it's not one size fits all, can't be cookie cutter, but being, people are more willing to have conversations now than were, I'd say, 3.5 years ago when we were initially talking as a collective group, the regional roundtable that I referenced of what could be in this space.
Great. So does anyone else want to add anything? Conor, you really got me thinking, and I was thinking in context of sort of the industrial policy that the Senate, the feds just passed, right? But unfortunately, we're not competing with China on housing. People still have to live here, so that's not pushing anything. But you never know what's going to happen with the feds and infrastructure and sort of working at the state. So gonna wrap up and thank you all. Thanks Lorraine Collins, Conor Dougherty, and Tommy Newman for joining our panel today, and of course the network for having us, and thank everyone in the audience, over 100 folks for joining us today. Check out the exhibitor gallery that the network has offered, and talk to you all soon.